All right. Welcome to Popular Liberty. Today we've got a very special book for you guys. This is for right now we're about to start talking about remember, in your history class in high school, they told you that the founding fathers were very, very suspicious of Catholics, and this is a book about why that was. And by the way, the Catholics were totally right back then, the popes, that is. And that this idea or philosophy of liberalism that had emerged was very, very dangerous to the natural order and would inevitably have terrible consequences. And they go into this book is about like the history of how we got to where we are. And this is a and this Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who is deceased. He's a 20th century author who like viciously opposed Vatican II, because this there we'll find out why later in probably future chapters. But this what happened, you see that the popes called everything that happened in the 20th century and the 21st century centuries ago. Like, they saw what was coming, and they tried to sound the warning alarm, but unfortunately they were kind of political novices and did not quite understand why these things were happening. And we will see some of that in the first two chapters. But I want to just start by I'm going to actually dedicate this first reading to Matthew Erickson, because when I was first reading this, my first thought was, God, this bishop is like it's like the Catholic version of Matthew Erickson, like 40 something years ago. And I just want to start reading this one quote from the preface that in this book, Marcel Lefebvre points out the deep roots of the evil of time, especially in the church, the cancer, or better yet, the AIDS, which is destroying the defenses of the church from within, has a name. Archbishop Lefebvre gives it its proper name: liberalism. On December 18, 1977, he had already said, the fruit that the devil presents to the modern world to deceive it is liberty. Liberty of man, set up as an absolute, is indeed the cause of the weakening of the faith in many, and even oftentimes the loss of faith. So let's start reading chapter 1. The origins of liberalism. If you do not read, sooner or later, you will sooner or later be traitors, because you will not have understood the root of evil. Father Paul Alongier, September 17th, 1981. It is with these words that one of my colleagues recommended to the seminarians the reading of good books on liberalism. Indeed, it is not possible to understand the present crisis of the church, or to know the true character of people in present-day Rome, or to find out the proper attitude to take vis-a-vis the events, without investigating the causes. In order to achieve this, it is necessary to go back into history and discover the primary cause, in that liberalism condemned by the popes for the past 2 centuries. We will set out from the origins, as the sovereign pontiffs do when they denounce the confusions that are at hand. Now, always, while indicting liberalism, the popes look farther into the past. All of them, from Pius VI to Benedict XV, take the crisis back to the struggle waged against the church in the 16th century by Protestantism, and to the naturalism of which this heresy was the cause and propagator. Naturalism is found beforehand in the Renaissance, which, in its efforts to recover the riches of ancient pagan cultures, and of the Greek culture and art in particular, came to glorify man, nature, and natural forces to an exaggerated degree. Yeah, and this is what we see this a lot in Aristotle. Like, why is it Aristotle is like proving God as like the first cause? Is he's responding to some of these critics who are like, I don't really believe in the gods. I don't really think they exist. And this this naturalist materialist identity goes all the way back to the it goes all the way back to ancient Greece. Like, this thing is not, we sort of think of it as going back to the Middle Ages. That's not really the case. In fact, it's actually goes back, to ancient Greece. Really, you have all cultures have that materialist mindset in it, where they don't believe in a god, really, or certainly not a personal one that you can have a relationship with. And that you see both the theistic and the atheistic identities basically all the way back. But in Greece, it was particularly cogent because it had a real philosophical backing to it, where they could actually make a lot of sense this way, where to the normal person. And so when we started to rediscover some of the ancient Greeks in Europe, yet we discovered some of the bad ideas too, and unfortunately they came back with a vengeance. And and what we're going to see later on is how liberalism is rooted in this naturalism that came from ancient Greece, or at least was resurrected from ancient Greece. Thoughts, LB? Nope.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you make the point that this is older than the Middle Ages. I think we were kind of saying beforehand, I'm not exactly sure where I stand as far as the definitions in this book quite yet, but it's interesting to read nonetheless. But precisely to the point, the bishop doesn't make that case in it. And maybe it's just because he hasn't studied the ancient Greeks as much. I would make the point that the materialism, at least as far as I understand it, would be, most codified in the philosophical school of Epicureanism.
Mm-hmm.
But to make the point, and you kind of alluded to it with Aristotle belaboring the idea of a prime, what he eventually calls the prime mover, that there has to be
Mm-hmm.
something that like kicks off this existence that we have. We also had, like, in later iterations in Greek, in Hellenistic culture, we have the Stoics, who were very providential, and in fact were probably farther away, probably more providential than even Catholicism, in the regard that they didn't really believe in a freedom of
Yeah.
will in any respect. So, or in any meaningful sense, right? The only thing you have control over is your judgment. So I think that's just a good. I think it's. I'm glad you tied it there, because he kind of this, like the naturalism thing. I can understand a little bit, and it seems to be a question of excess, right? To the degree to which the natural world is lauded over the maybe spiritual
Yeah.
fruits, we might
With
say.
naturalism, I think he goes on to define it a little bit better. That this, naturalism is the idea. He doesn't define it here, but he does in later chapters, where he
Yeah, he
define
does a little bit ahead of us too.
the
So
difference between like the kind of natural order idea that the church invented, and naturalism itself, is that the natural order assumes that there's a god, whereas naturalism kind of assumes there is no god, and that all of these not and that whereas the Catholic Church, like in Aquinas, where he believes that, hey, God set it up and ordered nature to work this way. And so,
mhm,
yes, nature does always work this way causally, but it is, nature itself is not a cause of itself. Whereas, we do put that first cause back to God. Whereas naturalism would say there is no God, nature is its own cause,
mhm,
or there's an infinite regression, and that doesn't matter. That's just we have an infinite universe that's infinitely old.
yep,
And so so when we say naturalism, we're basically saying it's the forerunner philosophy of atheism. Naturalism goes to nominalism, which then goes to atheism. And this is where we got that from, or secularism, more precisely. Not so much
mhm.
atheism, yes, but more precisely secularism. So so when he says naturalism, he's explicitly referring to this idea that, nature runs the way it does and there is no God. So
That works.
the so where were we? Yes. Naturalism is found beforehand in the Renaissance, which, in its efforts to recover the riches of ancient pagan cultures and of the Greek culture and art in particular, came to glorify man, nature, and natural forces to an exaggerated degree. In exalting the goodness and power of nature, one devalued and made disappear from the minds of men the necessity of grace. The fact that humanity is destined for the supernatural order and the light brought in by revelation. Under a pretext of art, they determined to introduce then everywhere, even in the churches, that nudism, we can speak without exaggeration of nudism, which triumphs in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. Without a doubt, without doubt, looked at from the point of view of art, those works have their value, but they have, alas, above all, a carnal aspect of the exaltation of the flesh that is really opposed to the teaching of the gospel. For the flesh covets against the spirit, says St. Paul, and the spirit militates against the flesh. I do not condemn this art if it is kept in secular museums, but I do not see in it a means of expressing the truth of the redemption, that is to say, the happy submission of nature restored by grace. But my judgment will certainly be different on the Baroque art of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, especially in the countries that resisted Protestantism. The Baroque will still call on chubby angels, but this art that is very much of movement and sometimes of pathetic expression is a cry of triumph for the redemption, a chant of victory for Catholicism over the pessimism of a cold and hopeless Protestantism. And and that's something you notice in like the difference between Renaissance art and Baroque art, that Baroque art is much more like vibrant and lively. And you get a lot of the same like motifs and themes in it, but you'll have such brighter colors. It's a happier sort of sort of artwork than the Renaissance is. The Renaissance is like cold and very realistic, very highly symmetrical, whereas whereas Baroque art is a lot more lifelike. And it's because during the Renaissance, Protestantism was thriving and was being born and thriving, and it was only that reflected itself in the artwork, or rather perhaps maybe that's a reversing of cause and effect, as he's arguing here that the naturalism of Greece was what influenced the European society and got it to turn to Protestantism. And when the Catholics later came along in the Counter-Reformation, the art that was being produced kind of changed itself back into a much more like happy depiction of nature that had been restored by grace. In other words, it was more like pre-fall reality as opposed to post-fall reality. And that's the main difference between Baroque art and Renaissance art. So you learn something every day. And so next headline, Protestantism.
So actually, real quick, so like an example of this, so we take Michelangelo's David. I got that right, yeah.
Yeah.
We take like the David, which is literally a cold literally just a cold marble statue, versus would the Pieta be like the mother holding the Jesus? Is that an example of Baroque then?
Yeah, I think that'd be an example. The one I think of is the depictions of the Last Supper, where like the Last Supper, it was by but the Last Supper by Da Vinci versus the Last Supper, I forget who did it after him. But there are two. I mean, you always see that this is like the classic example side by side, that the Baroque version of the Last Supper is way more colorful. It's not symmetrical, and because life is often not, and and it's has a much higher attention to detail than the Renaissance art does. And
And specifically Da Vinci's.
oh yeah, specifically Da Vinci's version of it, which is very symmetrical, very kind of plain. It's not detail oriented, and the colors are a lot less vibrant, and the it's just a depiction of reality restored by grace versus reality as it is right now.
Sure.
Which is rather cold. And so, and this is where he really starts to get into the meat of his argument, that speaking precisely, it can seem strange and paradoxical to qualify Protestantism as being naturalism, as there is nothing in Luther of this exaltation of the intrinsic good of nature, since according to him, nature is incurably fallen and the concupiscence is invincible. Nonetheless, the excessively nihilistic look that the Protestant casts onto himself as results in a practical naturalism by the dint of depreciating nature and exalting the force of faith alone. One relegates divine grace and the supernatural order to the domain of abstractions. And so let me put this in perspective for people. What he's saying, the reason that this has become such a problem is that what you've effectively done when you make faith alone, which is an internal act, what you've ended up doing is, so you've said that created people are the source of salvation, because it is that act that gives salvation to man. Therefore, therefore you've ended up basically completely taking God out of the picture inadvertently. And so this is where he's going to make the argument that, hey, it's this opposite extreme that has the exact same pragmatic effect as the naturalist extreme, because you've taken God out of the picture almost. And
right, because there's no grace, there's no revelation, and there's no grace that comes from God. There's just your profession of faith. Moreover, one of the, at least when I was raised, the distinction was also in that Catholicism, it's a matter of good works. It's not just faith alone. It's a matter of what you actually do in the world has an impact on your final judgment. And feel free to correct me where I go wrong.
Oh no, that's correct. And continuing with the reading,
I will say though, it's a little bit of mind reading to call it a practical nihilism. It's and this is more of a philosophical point, I guess, but it's worth belaboring, because there is a difference between Luther and the Protestants who came after him, and kind of the spillover effect that or the crack in the levee that was Luther turned into a spider web that eventually broke the levee, we might say.
Yeah.
Because so it's just again it's kind of a technical critique, but as I'm reading, these are the kinds of the things that I tend to pick up on, because he's not wrong about the whole. He's actually not wrong about the idea where if you remove the idea of revelation or grace, that when you remove those things, that it is kind of a nihilistic, because it's effectively whatever you decide. So there is no greater purpose to it. But yeah, it's just and again, and to the point, he's not writing as a philosopher, right? He's writing as a bishop, trying to tell the people who already follow him or who would follow him, how they should be thinking. So it's a different kind of writing style, but let's
he's not trying to make it like completely philosophically accurate, because he's trying to port it for it's just designed for a lay audience rather than a academic audience.
Yeah.
And so for the Protestants, grace does not operate as a true interior renewal. Baptism is not the restoring of a habitual supernatural state. It is only an act of faith in Jesus Christ, who justifies and saves. Nature is not restored by grace. It remains intrinsically corrupt. And faith obtains from God nothing more than this: he throws over our sins the modest cloak of Noah. So in other words, according to Luther, humanity is just such hot dog shit, and what God means when he's saving us is he's just throwing an image. He's like covering over the dog shit. We still remain intrinsically dog shit, but God is covering us in his grace so that you can't see it and you can't smell it. He's like, but he's really sweeping our terribleness under the rug, is what is, according to Luther, what salvation is. And it's this extreme, which and the is, we are justified and we are saved by by simply a force of our interior will that makes this happen, that we accept the covering of God. And this is the number one thing that sets up Protestantism and liberalism, because it makes man the arbiter of his own salvation effectively, and it completely separates us from God, and in a way that the Catholic idea did not have. And this is where we get the origin of liberalism, is right here in Martin Luther. And so from then on, the whole supernatural organism that baptism has just added to nature by taking root in it, all the infused virtues and gifts of the Holy Spirit are reduced to nothing, brought back as they are to that lone frenzied act of faith. Confidence in a Redeemer who spares only to withdraw far from his creature. Leaving an ever so colossal abyss between man, permanently miserable, and the thrice holy transcendent God. This pseudo supernaturalism, as Father Reginald Garrigou-Larang calls it, in the end leaves man, although redeemed, to the mere strength of his natural virtues. He collapses fatally into naturalism. So well do the opposite extremes join up. Jean-Marc Maritain well expresses the naturalist outcome of Lutheranism. Human nature, will only have to reject as a vain theological accessory the cloak of grace that is nothing for it, and to take back onto itself its faith confidence, in order to become that nice emancipated beast whose unbroken, infallible progress delights the universe today. So basically, by taking this nihilistic view of humanity that Luther does, he makes us so far away from God that you end up with a practical naturalism, and that and it is this idea that that if all that separates, all that unites us to God is just this cloak of grace, then all I have to do is reject it, and at that point I'm done. No more God, because he's so far away, he might as well not exist. And that's what this idea of total depravity, this idea that humanity is so thoroughly flawed that he's basically irredeemable. This is called total depravity. That's his proper name. And so this totally depraved view of humanity is, in a sense, naturalism. It has the exact same effect.
Yeah, because if something is completely depraved, then what's the point in divinity?
Exactly.
Right. Now,
and here,
does he, real quick, because as we're reading it, I think it's worth asking, does he ever go through and address Luther's points later in the book, or make reference to it? That if you finished it, I'm only a few chapters in.
Yeah, I've gone through it. He does address it a little bit more fully, but it's kind of assumed what he's talking about,
Right.
and he doesn't go too deep into it. He really starts to hammer home. He's only hammering home, here's the origins of liberalism.
Correct.
Whereas, the book is more focused not on Protestantism, but on liberalism, and why liberalism is an apostasy, for Catholicism. And so let's see how this logic of total depravity gets applied. So this naturalism will be applied especially to the civic and social order. Grace being reduced to a fiduciary sentiment of faith, the redemption now consists only of an individual and a private religiosity, without a hold on the public life. The public order, economical and political, is therefore condemned to live and develop itself outside the church of our Lord Jesus Christ. At the extreme, the Protestants will look for his criterion for the criterion of his justification in the eyes of God in his economic success. It is this sense that he will gladly inscribe onto the door of his house this sentence of the Old Testament: honor God with thy goods, give him the first fruits of all thy revenues, and then thy granaries will be abundantly filled, and thy cisterns will overflow with wine. So where have we seen this before? Not just that we see this, in the social gospel. We see this, in the gospel of wealth, and we see this in libertarianism. Where libertarian is probably the apex of the this is, I like why Matt Erickson calls it, very distilled Protestantism. Because it is the absolute distillation. The perfect Protestantism is what libertarianism consists of, because it's fully naturalist, fully rational, and fully liberal. And this is it's by far the most coherent version of Protestantism. And so and how does it measure itself? Basically by economic success. It's the fruit of its morality is economic success. That they're right because they're profitable, basically. And you see how good this is for the economy and for human flourishing and prosperity and all that. That's their claim to hold the moral high ground. And so he's predicting this probably 50, 60 years ago. And he goes into like the popes predicting all of this hundreds of years ago. And that's we're going to get into that probably in later chapters, though. But Jacques Maritain has some good words on the materialism of Protestantism, which will give birth to the economic liberalism and to capitalism. And not quite sure how he's defining capitalism here.
Yeah, that's a constant thing in this. Are his definitions, because they're really malleable.
Can be, yeah.
Yeah, they're yeah. But I'll kind of get to that as we get towards the end of the second chapter.
Behind Luther's appeals to the Lamb who saves, behind his outbursts of confidence and his faith in the pardon of sins, there is a human creature who raises up his head and who arranges his affairs very well in the mud where he is immersed by the fault of Adam. He will manage in the world. He will follow the thirst for power, the imperialist instinct, the law of the world, which is his world. God will only be an ally, but a mighty one. In other words, not a king. God, under Protestantism, the king does not rule and God does not. And God does not either. He is so far away that he's practically non-existent. Thus, the result of Protestantism will be that man will attach themselves more to the goods of this world and forget the eternal goods. If Puritanism comes to exercise an exterior supervision over public morality, it will not impregnate men's hearts with the truly Christian spirit, which is a supernatural spirit called the primacy of the spiritual. Protestantism will be led necessarily to proclaim the emancipation of the temporal from the spiritual. Now, it is precisely that emancipation that one will find again in liberalism. And this is where he's now making the pivot to, let's talk about liberalism. Because what ends up happening is, this is why you get the social gospel. This is why you get progressivism and more fully neoliberalism. This is where these ideas come from, where they're here to emancipate people. And this is where you also get the French Revolution, and before all of it, this is where you get the French Revolution, particularly, which really wanted to emancipate people from the Catholic Church, from the spiritual. And they looted the Catholic Church multiple times. And and this is actually one of the key differences between the revolution in the French Revolution and the American Revolution, was that the American Revolution was founded by people who wanted to be more Christian. Granted, it was a very weird and wacky kind of Christianity and Puritanism, but they were still like nominally Christian. They still wanted to be more Christian as they saw it. Whereas the French Revolution, on the other hand, they wanted to be as far as they could away from Christianity. They really wanted to be emancipated. They full blown emancipated from this, from the spiritual, from spirituality. And it's only in later years, that in America that we, with progressivism, that we finally get that full desire, and the sexual revolution as well, where they want to emancipate the world basically from God, from Christianity, and make it a fully secularized institution, complete with like trannies and children cutting their balls off. And this is where it comes from. So let's see. The popes then had a good reason to denounce this naturalism of Protestant inspiration as the origin of liberalism that disrupted Christianity in 1789 and 1848. Thus, Leo XIII says, "This audacity of faithless men, which threatens civil society every day with more serious destruction, and which stirs up anxiety and trouble in all minds, has its cause and its origin in those poisoned doctrines which spread out in these latest times among the peoples like seeds of vices, have borne very malignant fruits in their season. Indeed, you know very well, venerable brethren, that the cruel war that has been declared since the 16th century against the Catholic faith by the innovators, aimed at this goal of turning aside all revelation and overthrowing the whole supernatural order. In order that access may be opened up to the discoveries, or rather the frenzies of unaided reason." Closer to our time, Benedict XV says, "Since the first 3 centuries and the origins of the church, in the course of which the blood of Christians has fertilized the entire earth, one can say that the church never was in such a danger as that which showed itself at the end of the 18th century. It was then indeed that a philosophy in delirium, a prolonging of the heresy and the apostasy of the innovators, acquired a universal power of seduction over the minds and brought about a total bewilderment, with the settled purpose of ruining Christian foundations in society, not only in France, but little by little all of the nations." The
And
birth of
Innovators is
political
and it just real quick, Innovators is a placeholder for the Protestant reformers.
Yes,
Just
correct.
making that note for the listeners.
And so the birth of political naturalism. Protestantism had set up a very harsh attack against the church and caused a deep tearing of Christianity in the 16th century. That is, in the Protestant Reformation. But it did not succeed in penetrating the Catholic nations with the venom of its political and social naturalism until this secularizing spirit had reached the academics, and then those so-called philosophers of the Enlightenment. And where have we seen this before? When the commies tried to take over, what was the first institution they took? The universities.
University, right?
And not just here in America, but you also see it in Germany. This is where we got socialism from. Was the first the first institution that these liberals, the socialists, the secularists, when those people took over, they did. The first place that they took over was the universities. The reason being is that's where all of the elites are trained. So wherever your universities are, that is that's the main battle. This is why Curtis Yarvin says that the universities are as close to a center for the cathedral as as there is. The cathedral is decentralized, and that's in order to make it more powerful. But if there is a center, it's the universities, because that's where all of the elites are trained. That's where that's where every journalist is trained. That's where every uh, hierarchy. Every higher up in the State Department is trained. That's where all of the where the legislatures and the presidents are all trained. This is where all of the corporate businessmen are trained, or at least nearly all. Not every, not
Well, and they're
100%, but
also it's
close
also the
to it.
standard too, right? It's also the standard for it as well. So it's not just a matter of the person who will eventually go to Harvard Law. It's also the fact that the person who never thought that they could get into Harvard Law will still want to follow those people and do
Mm-hmm.
what they think and say. It's a matter of
Exactly.
mimicry and copying because of their place within the hierarchy of society. And for good reason, for good reason we might say, which is one of the reasons why the corruption of it has been is so deleterious. And to the point, we're talking a lot about government officials, but the point should be made that a lot of people who would become priests in the church and then bishops
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Yeah,
Very,
yeah. The
this is
seminary.
mm-hmm,
Back then,
the
the seminary and
seminary
the university were basically one and the same.
and well, in fact, most major universities started as some kind of seminary
Exactly.
as well. So they share a common ancestry and history in that
Mm-hmm.
regard too.
And this was what, like, the biggest innovation the Catholic Church ever came up with. And the way the Protestants and the secularists and the liberals hijacked society was by hijacking the institution of the university, which the Catholic Church had invented. This was our main innovation that gave us the ability to create such a prosperous and great society starting around the 12th century. Was that we invented the universities, which gave us the ability to educate all of the rulers. The
Yeah.
entire ruling class was educated by the Catholic Church, and
Well, and one
this was our main seat of power. And this was why, again, in the French Revolution, this was the first thing they tried to take over, was the universities. Ditto in Germany, when the liberals and the socialists started taking over, the first institution was the universities. That was the one they wanted, because that's where the rulers and elites get trained. And if you can put your poisonous ideology into their minds, this is how you take control of a civilization. And so but and by the way, I want to do a shameless plug for Mises GOP right now, because hey, we understand where the battle needs to be fought. We need to take the fight to the universities, and that has to start with the secondary with the education system at the lower ranks. So one of the things that Mises GOP really wants to do is use local governments and local power to start taking the fight to the liberals. So you know how they can play this game of of forcing their doctrines on and trying to indoctrinate children. Two can play that game, and we fully intend to. So we'd like we would using your money, if you want to help us take the fight directly to the education system, to the universities, by electing good Misesian libertarians, preferably Christians as well. If you want to help us take the fight to the enemy and reverse this this task, that reverse the secularization, reverse the liberalism that has been poisoning society, please donate monthly at misesgop.org/donate, because you must understand, the universities, the education system, this is the main battle. This we win here, we win everywhere else. And so that the battle for human civilization, the battle for the West, and or really what's left of it, must be fought in the education system, starting at the local level. We have to take the fight to the enemy, to their center, and break them. And so if this is something you believe in, if you want to see Rothbard taught in schools, if you want to see Aquinas taught in schools, if you want a return of Christianity, if you want to say, hey, give me Christ the King back, if that's what you believe, donate to Mises GOP at misesgop.org/donate. Please donate monthly. Any little bit helps. Every from $2, $3, $10, whatever you can do monthly. I know inflation is high, but whatever you can still afford to donate monthly, it makes a big difference. And this is how we win. All right, shameless plug over.
Mind if I pick it up for a bit?
Go ahead.
So these so-called philosophers of the Enlightenment, in reality, philosophically, Protestantism and juridical positivism have a common origin in the nominalism of the decadent Middle Ages, which led as well to Luther with his purely extrinsic and nominal idea of the redemption, as to Descartes with his idea of an unintelligible divine law submitted to the purely arbitrary decisions of God's will. All of Christian
Let's
philosophy.
define
Go ahead.
nominalism for people. You know, just so
Yeah, I looked it up earlier just because I was like trying to make sure that I understood what it, because it's not really a term that I use too often. But basically, I found using I mean, I always use Stanford Plato,
Mhm,
but it's basically the idea that either there are no universal
mhm.
ideas, but also nominalism can refer to the idea that to the idea. Nominalism can refer to that school of thought which says that ideas have no correlation to the thing, that things exist and there are just our ideas to
Yeah.
describe the thing, that they don't
Essentially,
actually connect.
yeah, essentially, it's that idea that there are no absolute truths. And, you know, there's the quick retort as well, are you absolutely sure? And
Well, as the
that,
practicing skeptic here, I
yeah,
don't completely disagree with that,
yeah,
Um,
somewhat.
well,
That,
so
that
and
yeah,
so in that it connects
right.
to theology, though, I take the Montaigne, who was a Renaissance line, which is that to the extent that we can know things is through grace, which is that, and otherwise we are just kind of muddling through the dark, which is where I would accept the words of the Pope of Pope, was it Pope Benedict XV here, who says or no, it was Leo the 13th, who says that unaided reason, and I do agree with that,
Mhm.
but where I also might be considered marginally nominalist otherwise, just as a matter of course.
Yeah. And the so go ahead and pick up where you were coming from.
Just as soon as I find my place. Here we go. The natural law, blah, 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 affirmed with Thomas Aquinas. Wait, nope. Okay.
No,
As to
all of
Descartes,
Christian philosophy.
yeah, as to Descartes, with his idea of an unintelligible divine law submitted to the purely arbitrary decisions of God's will. All of Christian philosophy, however, affirmed with St. Thomas Aquinas the unity of eternal divine law and of the natural human law. Quote, the natural law is nothing except a participation in the eternal law by the rational creature, writes the angelic doctor. With Descartes, a break is already made between the divine right and the natural human right. After him, the academics and the jurists will not be long in practicing the same separation. Thus, Hugo Grotius, 1625, summed up by Paul Hazard. Divine right, Grotius tries to safeguard it. What we have just said, he declares, would take place even if we should grant what cannot be conceded without a crime, that there is no God, or that human affairs are not the object of his solicitude. Since God and providence exist without any doubt, we have here a source of right in addition to that which emanates from nature. This natural right itself can be attributed to God, since the divinity has willed that such principles exist in us. The law of God, the law of nature, continues Paul Hazard, this double formula. It is not Grotius who invented it. The Middle Ages knew it already. Where is its character of newness? How does it happen that it is criticized, condemned by the doctors? For whom does it create a stir? The novelty consists in the separation of the two terms, which they try to insinuate, in their opposition, which they tend to assert, in an attempt at conciliation as an afterthought, by which its mere self supposes the idea of rupture. And so what he's driving at here, and you correct me where I'm going wrong, is this is the degree to which Enlightenment philosophers in general kind of take the idea of reason and kind of separate it out from the rest of human being.
Hmm.
That, which is kind of the term I've been using recently to kind of describe the thing we're sort of
Yeah.
driving at here. And to that I completely agree. But what is
Yeah.
interesting though, as I was reading this part, is there is a bit of a correlation to Descartes in this. Where was it here?
Luther was a
The
big
law.
fan.
That what?
Luther was a big fan of Descartes.
Yeah, well, and Descartes had some things to say, right? We still use the
Hmm.
Cartesian plane.
Yeah, pretty much.
Um, That was pretty good. Calculus, I don't use it a lot, but supposedly it's a good thing.
Well, he didn't do calculus. That was Isaac Newton. But he
Didn't he expand calculus, or am I
no, he
misremembering
invented
my
it. But
philosophy lectures
Descartes was a heavy influence on
on
Newton.
calculus?
On
On Newton. Okay.
Newton. Yeah, Newton was
See,
the one who invented it.
my problem is always like
Yeah.
dates are bad for me, so like I don't always remember who comes before when. It's like this eternal conversation in my
Oh
mind.
yeah,
There was
and he
something
actually
in
goes
here.
on to explain later that
Mhm.
actually a lot of people, they don't like saying who their influences are. If they're really big thinkers, they don't like saying, they like to pretend they're original and they're really not. And
Yeah.
one thing that Newton did was he went back to all of his old diaries and erased Descartes' name out of it, so people wouldn't know. And
Ego, man, right?
uh,
Ego.
yeah,
It's
exactly. And
the thing I
like
picked up on there was that the idea of that God is being put in us, which is something that Descartes talks about in his five meditations.
yeah.
Um,
and
but
this idea here that this is like the birth of where this idea that reason and faith are opposed to each other. And whereas in the Catholic idea, because God himself, the first truth, the first cause, is knowable through love. God is love. He who loves is born of God and knows God, for God is love. That's where this idea of our epistemology comes from. This is where our idea of faith leads us, that not only are faith and reason not opposed to each other, that they are mutually dependent on each other, because to the knowledge of God is completely possible. Like, I experience God through love. The words there in Greek is that is that you actually physically experience God through love. So this knowledge of the first cause of the universe comes to is actually possible. So this is where the Catholic epistemology is very different than the Protestant epistemology, which says that I can't know anything outside of myself. And and that I am such basically dog shit, that I don't even know how it is that God loves me, and I'm such a piece of shit that I can't possibly like love him back, and I can't be to any meaningful degree, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all very different from the Catholic idea, which is no, is that the human does not need to use his own human love to love God back, is that the Spirit comes down and assists us in doing so, and all we're doing as humans is exerting our human will to reciprocate God's own love back to him. And so God's giving us the divine love. We use our human will and our human reason to reciprocate it back to him, his own love back to him. And this is how we come to have a real knowledge of God. The word there is gnosis. In Greek, it's the masculine version of gnosis, which means you have a perception of you can have a perception of the supernatural in this, that you can actually perceive the divine essence physically. And so so when you when you do this, when you do what Luther and the Protestants have done, you basically destroy epistemology, because you make God unknowable. And this is why Luther has such scruples, and this is why this is from his nominalism, that how can I know that I'm saved? How can I know that I'm connected to God? And what he ends up coming to is just, it must be faith alone. It must be this surge of belief that gives me based entirely on faith. I have no reason for it at all. But it's just I take it entirely on faith that I am saved. And and this is where he gets the idea that famous quote of his that's like, that like, do not sin, but if you do, sin boldly, because and have even more bold faith, and believe even more strongly, or something like that, to where it's a very, very weird, in particularly in a Christian sense, where you would say sin, but then believe you're saved, which is which greatly sums up a lot of the more mega church believers who are like the social gospel and all that. Where you really see that idea come out in force. that because you have such material wealth, therefore you can believe that you are saved because you're doing well, not that you're doing you can believe you're doing good because you have material wealth, which is not at all the Catholic doctrine, which is like, hey, this can happen to the good and the bad alike. So
right, because that would be the position.
mm-hmm.
All right,
And
well,
so
let's try and knock out this first chapter.
yeah.
Yeah. So the jurist Pufendorf, 1672, and the philosopher Locke, 1689, completed the secularization of the natural right. This obviously has tons of interplay with libertarianism. The philosophy of the Enlightenment imagines a state of nature that has no more to do with the realism of Christian philosophy, and that culminates in the idealism with the myth of the good savage of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Little bit of overplay because Rousseau and Locke are kind of at odds, but fine. The natural law is reduced to a cohesion of sentiments which man has of himself and which are shared by the majority of men. The following dialogue is found in Voltaire. What is the natural law? The instinct that makes us feel just. What do you call just and unjust? What appears as such to the entire world. Such an outcome is the fruit of a reason that has lost its way, that in its thirst for emancipation from God and his revelation has likewise burned the bridges connecting it with the simple principles of the natural order, which the supernatural divine revelation recalls and the magisterium of the Church confirms. If the Revolution separated the civil power from the power of the Church, that is, at root, because it had already for a long time been separating faith and reason for those who adorn themselves with the name of philosophers. It will not be out of place to recall what the First Vatican Council teaches on this subject. Not only can faith and reason never be in disagreement, but they mutually lend themselves support as well, since right reason demonstrates the foundations of faith and, illuminated with the light of faith, devotes itself to the knowledge of the divine thing, while faith, for its part, frees and protects reason from errors and teaches it with a multifaceted learning. The revolution took place precisely in the name of the goddess reason. I really did like how he made the point of the goddess reason, and it
Yes.
just as that ties to the masculine,
He goes
feminine
way into
order
that later.
chaos. Yeah, it's an interesting point for sure. Of the goddess reason, of reason deified, of the reason that sets itself up as the supreme norm of truth and falsity, of good and evil. You can now catch a glimpse from this of how much all these errors overlap one another. Liberalism, naturalism, finally rationalism, which are only complementary aspects of what must be called the revolution. There, where right reason, illuminated by faith, sees only harmony and subordination, the deified reason hollows out the abysses and raises up walls. Nature without grace, material prosperity without the searching for eternal goods, that's the key, the civil power separated from the ecclesiastical power, politics without God or Jesus Christ, the rights of man against the rights of God, and finally, freedom without truth. It is in that spirit that the revolution happened. It was being prepared for more than 2 centuries already in people's minds, as I have tried to show you. It is only at the end of the 18th century that it succeeded and bore its decisive fruits, its political fruits, due to the writings of the philosophers, the encyclopedists, and of unimaginable activity of Freemasonry, which, in a few decades, had penetrated and set up cells within the whole ruling class.
And now that is a part that we're going to have to dive into, because this is where I start to go back to my archotropism thesis of why is it particularly that the that when you create so much prosperity, this is basically my argument from the third law of archotropism of why like America particularly ended up becoming a superpower. Because you had a great underconsumption of wealth, which necessarily leaves more for the private people who are going to use it to build material wealth and prosperity. And in doing so, you create power centers outside of the state, which will then overthrow it, necessarily so. and because power demands consolidation. Basically, it wants to be consolidated from low concentration to high concentration because the strong basically prey upon the weak. And so basically it's the that's the value maximization process for a zero-sum system, where you go from 1% of the pie to 2% of the pie to 3% of the pie. It doesn't matter, how big the pie is. That it's only how much of the pie that you have that matters in a system, in a zero-sum system, where and so value maximization occurs by going from 1% to 2% to 3% incrementally. And so, that's why it will go from a low concentration to a high concentration. It's a value maximization behavior. And so, and this is, I won't get into the why libertarians are wrong right there, and how that proves a lot of their dogmas wrong. But but for going back to the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church is building Western civilization, by the way, shout out to Keith Knight. We read How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization by Tom Woods. We kind of read that book and analyzed it the other night on his show, Don't Tread on Anyone, with Keith Knight. It was a really, really good conversation. You guys should definitely check it out. But the sum of it, or the short version of it, is that the Catholic Church, through its Catholic monarchy particularly, was responsible for all of the production of Western civilization. Everything good about it is necessarily Catholic in origin, because we basically invented all of it. From the universities to the scientific method to pretty much all of the scientific disciplines, and all of the and everything that all from all the hospitals, all medicine, all of this was a product of the Catholic Church. All of this material wealth was because of Catholic monarchs deferring that gratification, or more correctly, being unable to defer it, because unable not to defer it through their through that institution of monarchy, which has a very, very low time preference for power, and thus will naturally lend itself to a much more productive atmosphere. Where you end up and unintentionally producing power centers outside of the church, which overthrow it. And so, when you have all of this wealth being produced outside of the state, and you end up with a demand, and the state itself being weak internally, compared to them, well, what does that naturally look like? Power demands consolidation, and the state's power is going to get consolidated to the outside to the market, basically. And this is where you get people like the Freemasons, like liberalism, like the oligarchs, who were getting more powerful than states and had a will to overthrow it. This is where that happened. So they saw an opportunity in Martin Luther, and this is why, like the king of Germany, or I think it was Hamburg, or they had a whole bunch of them back then, but it was a whole bunch of German states.
This is where the political analysis comes into play, because of course, why did Henry VIII break with Rome? Henry VIII broke with Rome because he wanted to screw other chicks. He wanted to have other wives, and he wouldn't be granted his thing. So it was that crack, right, of what because okay, again, correct me where I go wrong. It's been a long time since I've studied this, but Martin Luther didn't set out to overturn and create a new form of Christianity, right?
Nope.
He sought out to be the reformer. And what invariably happened, in part because of the burghers looking, the individual burghers looking for power to become kings unto themselves, they kind of took advantage of his idea, which is a point I always make with all thinkers, is that there is the thinker and there is his followers. There are always these natural dualistic tendencies within all of this.
This is also Purnell's iron law of bureaucracy. where basically Luther has started out with an intent. He's like the initial guy, the true believer, and then there's the people who actually behave that incentives of an institution, which in this case would be the burghers, where they behave, or in Purnell's iron law of oligarchy, or iron law of bureaucracy. No, iron law of bureaucracy, I think, not iron law of oligarchy. But basically, the bureaucrats are the ones who end up in charge, and the oligarchs are really the ones who end up in charge, because they're the ones actually behaving the incentives of the new system set out by Martin Luther, and they took advantage of it necessarily because This is market demand at work for the market of power. The market of power
And
is
not
always zero sum.
Yeah, and not to belabor the point too much, but
Hmm.
this is and in fact the reason why the oligarchs are the ones who behave it is because the king is always supposed to be a part, right? Like
Hmm.
that's the whole concept of the kingly person. In addition to the military, the militaristic leadership aspect of it, you might say in a proto sense, but when it becomes a symbol and something that is transmitted instead of a matter of conquering, we might say,
Hmm.
when it's like
Yep.
passed along, it's because the king has to be in the same way in which the president has to be. The president is supposed to be above, right? It is the head of state as opposed to the head of
Yep.
government in a strictly political analysis as well.
Hmm. And not ju- and this is where Martin Luther's idea of a really far away God comes into place. This is
Hmm.
because it gives the state a pretext for having a state without God. This is what this is where the secular state was born. What was these ideas right here? God is so far away because man is such totally depraved. That he
Yeah.
cannot. He's basically beyond redemption, and so you have a far away God, and now you have the pretext for the states splitting from Rome, because what used to happen was your pope was basically the international lawyer for all of the kings.
Hmm.
The Catholic Church invented international law, by being
Hmm.
the mediators between different popes. Excuse me, between different kings, and excommunicating them if they did something really bad. And this was a
Right.
very common back then, for if kings had a dispute, instead of fighting it out with each other, which they still did sometimes, they would basically appeal to Rome to be their judge, because the Pope was generally seen as more powerful than the kings, but because he was a sovereign, a sacred ruler instead of a sovereign, he could be, that's why they could appeal to him. He was not a king of kings. He was a lawyer for kings, or a
Right.
judge for kings,
And this
and
is
by go ahead.
it's also what allows for the simultaneous hierarchies within a given country as well
Hmm.
that Hoppe has kind of talked about.
Yes.
I know he's talked about in his Property and Freedom Society, like I think the chat from like 2 or 3 years ago. But he talks about like the idea that the church is actually able to stand in as a secondary hierarchy as a check against the
Hmm.
against the excesses of the king, we might say.
Exactly.
So let's go with the propagator of these errors so we can move into the actual definition of liberalism. Of course, this is Freemasonry. With
Hmm.
what precision, with what clear-sightedness the sovereign pontiffs denounce this enterprise, Pope Leo XIII exposes in his Quad Apostolici. Hang on, my
Apostolici.
Latin is good. Yep, already quoted. And again with the encyclical Humanum Genus of August 20th, 1884, on the sect of the Freemasons. Quote, in our time, the instigators of evil seem to have formed a coalition in an immense effort under the impulse and with the help of a society spread out in a great number of places and skillfully organized, the Society of the Freemasons. In their vigilant solicitude for the salvation of the Christian people, our predecessors had very quickly recognized this principal enemy at the moment when, coming out of darkness of an occult conspiracy, it sprang forth to the attack in the full light of day. Leo XIII then mentions the popes who had already condemned Freemasonry, Clement XII, and the encyclical In Eminenti of April 27, 1738, brought excommunication against the Freemasons. Benedict XIV renewed this condemnation in the encyclical Providas of March 16, 1751. Pius VII, with the encyclical Ecclesiam of September 13, 1821, particularly denounced the Carbonari. Leo XII, which is with his apostolic constitution Quo Gravoria of March 13th, 1826, unmasked, in addition to the secret society my French is
The
also,
Universitaire.
yeah, which was attempting to pervert the youth. Pius VIII, with his encyclical Traditi of May 24th, 1829, Pius IX, with his consistorial allocution of September 25th, 1865, and the encyclical Quanta Cura of December 8th, 1864, spoke in the same way.
God, I'm
Then
glad you had to read all that instead of me.
then, deploring how little the governments were taking into account these very serious warnings, Leo XIII reports the dreadful progress of the sect.
And by the way,
Quote,
I just want to reiterate the point right there, that there was it was the states. The reason they did very little about it is that they had an incentive not to. They get way more power by having a separation of church and state
Mm-hmm.
than they do by having the church be the the head of the head of state, or I should say the
Yeah.
conscience of the head of state. And
Mm-hmm.
it was not that we had any philosophical problems really within the church itself that caused liberalism. It was that
Yeah.
we had problems outside of the church that necessarily is a bad state. This is why I advocate a corporate monarchy instead of a medieval monarchy, because a corporate monarchy would not have this problem. And for reasons we won't get into tonight,
Yeah.
but a
We
medieval
should.
monarchy does. And
Mm-hmm.
this is exactly what happened. That it was states that gave us liberalism, ironically, because they wanted more power, not because of anything that the Catholic Church had to do with it. In fact, it happened in spite of the Catholic Church, not
Yeah.
because of it.
The whole concept of separation of church and state was, I was just talking to a friend about this the other night,
Mhm.
and I was trying to map it out, and I've been doing a lot more like sketching on my whiteboard to try and map out some of these ideas. And
Yep.
it was basically two waves emanating from the same point throughout, that same point maybe being,
Yeah.
the start of human civilization, we might say. But so therefore there is there's before that, and then there's of course after that. And it's basically
This,
two waves that are kind of moving, and at different points in time they intersect, and at different points in times they might have like slight, be slightly off from one another. And like I was pointing, I'm
mhm.
like, this little thing right here is what we call separation of church and state, right? And in that's on a curb, but the human being exists
Mhm.
with the same foundation at both point A and point B. And point A
Yes.
is before separation between church and state. Point B is the human being during the separation of church and state.
You could say
Arguably, we're
that
moving into an age of
you could
C.
say that the separation of church and state that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. By the way, George Washington was a Freemason, like explicitly a Freemason. We know
Yes,
that for a
a lot
fact.
of the founders were.
Oh yeah. And so they're getting into Freemasonry right here, it's like, oh yeah, understand the founding fathers were really suspicious of the Catholic Church for exactly this reason, that the popes were not their
Mhm.
friends. The Catholic Church was not their friends. And so there you could say that the separation of church and state that the founding fathers gave us was preceded by the separation of the Catholic Church and state of Martin
Of
Luther.
Protestantism.
Yep.
It results from this that, quoting Leo XIII, in the lapse of a century and a half, the sect of Freemasons has made unbelievable progress. Using at the same time boldness and cunning, it has invaded all the ranks of the social hierarchy and is beginning to seize a power in the bosom of modern states, which is the equivalent to sovereignty. What would he say now, going back to the bishop, when there is no government that does not comply with the decrees of the Masonic lodges? It is now for the assault on the hierarchy of the church that the Masonic spirit, or Masonry itself, rises up with ranks closed. I will come back to that topic. What is then the Masonic spirit? Here you have it declared in a few words from the mouth of Senator Goblet de Avilo, member of the Grand Orient of Belgium, speaking on August 5th, 1877, at the Lodge of the Philanthropic Friends of Brussels. Say to the neophytes that Masonry is above all a school of vulgarization and a finishing school, a sort of laboratory where the great ideas of the age come to be combined and affirmed in order to spread out in the secular world in a tangible and practical form. Tell them, in a word, that we are the philosophy of liberalism. It is enough to tell you, dear readers, that even if I do not always name it, Freemasonry is at the center of the topics of which I am going to speak to you in all the following chapters.
Yes, because they are the progenitors of liberalism. Whatever the definition of liberalism you may choose, it always has its origins in the Freemasons, who are the group outside of the church, outside of the state, that sought the overthrow of both the church and the state and succeeded on basically both fronts. Because again, because of archotropism, you have power that is accumulated outside of the state power centers outside of the state will necessarily seek to overthrow it, because that's economics. That is economic demand. Power demands consolidation, from low concentration to high concentration. And if the state is the low concentration, they're going to get consolidated by the high
Well,
concentrations.
I was
And
even
that was the
thinking of
Freemasons.
I was even thinking of like the time of the church fathers as well, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the Council of Nicaea in particular, of this power, this decentralized power. We might even make an
Yep.
analogy to the decentralized power of the Freemasons that Christianity
Mm-hmm.
actually had, at, towards the fall of Rome, and then and subsequently afterwards. And so I was kind of thinking about that in regards to the, I guess, the archotropism framework, right? But it's part of
Mm-hmm.
that where like that power that was held within the Catholic Church necessarily needed to coalesce into something greater.
Yes, it
And
did. And the reason why, what the that started with it was an event called Caesaropapism, where the Caesar, recognizing the power that the church had, back in the fifth, sixth centuries, started trying to have a power struggle with the Pope, who was seen as the first among equals and primate. He had the primacy of Rome. That was a fairly well established doctrine back in the day, because
mm-hmm.
Peter, you are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Christ is giving Peter a primacy there. And so
Yeah.
what happened, what was that the emperor back then started trying to appoint the popes and appoint the bishops, and this happened a lot, and he lost the power struggle actually with the Catholic Church at that time, or I should say the See of Rome. He lost it to the Roman pontiff. So what did he end up doing? He moved the capital of Rome to Byzantium, to Constantinople, where he found the patriarch of Constantinople, and he had a much easier time dealing with that guy. And historically, he was the Roman emperor in Constantinople was much more able to to beat up the patriarch of Constantinople and appoint him, and this happened repeatedly. Not only did it happen under the Roman Empire, it also happened under the Seljuk Turks afterwards. Because what was the first thing
Yeah.
that the Seljuk Turks did was they killed the previous patriarch of Constantinople when they took over in the 15th century, and then they installed one of their own, and then they would repeatedly auction off the office of the office of the Patriarch of Constantinople to the highest bidder, and because they were they're Muslims, whether they care. And
Yeah.
so you had a real hardcore break in the apostolic succession there, kind of.
Yeah. Well,
To
and it's
where
interesting to think about the degree to which Eastern Orthodox denominations tend to be more ethnic in their nature, but also tend to be far
yes.
more tied into the political system as well of the various countries.
Somewhat, yeah. Not in most of the Muslim. That's really only this case in Russia and kind of northeastern Europe, because in all of basically there's four major synods of. Originally there were four major synods of Eastern Orthodoxy. Out of the four, three of them are controlled by Islam, and the fourth is ruled over by the ocean, because Alexandria is 30 feet underwater. So it would be 4 out of 4, but it's 3 out of 4. And they ended up and after the Seljuk Turks moved in, they moved and they started just causing all kinds of problems for Constantinople. They moved north to Russia, and they got the benevolent graces, shall we call them, of the Russians, and starting off with the Mongolians.
Yeah, of the Slavic people, we might say. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this way. It's like was remarking the other night that to a bunch of Orthodox friends, like what a really tragic history they had in the Russian Orthodox Church was just is one. It's like a series of unfortunate events. If you ever read that book series, I mean, it's just one thing after another that just kicks their asses all throughout history. But what the Catholic Church did that they didn't do was that we established a pope who was in charge of all of the bishops, appointing all the bishops. That made all of the bishops like they're his subordinates. So whenever that the states would try to bully the individual bishops into appointing their handpicked guy, they could just defer to Rome. Oh well, let me ask the Pope. It's not my. And basically this is how the Pope became an international superpower, was that all the bishops reported to him. and that
Well,
he
not
was
just the
he was the all
bishops,
powerful
right?
bishop.
And not just the bishops, but the abbots
Mhm.
as well, because
Yes,
you have the multiple hierarchies
and the
within the
heads of the
Catholic Church as
universities.
well, which is difficult for, I think, outsiders to kind
Mhm.
of like people outside the church to understand.
Yep. And the
Is
heads
the
of the
degree to which.
universities at that time who educated
Hmm.
the ruling class were all direct. They had to get their charter for their university from the Pope. So it's like all the institutions basically reported to Rome. They
Yeah.
reported to the Pope, and it was through this particular innovation that we figured out how to master the states. We beat the states because the Catholic Church innovated the office of the Pope, whereas the other Eastern states always had problems with the states, meddling in church affairs because they did not have this all-powerful institution, or
Hmm.
and or this or at least internationally powerful institution that that could stand up to them. That could, the Pope was the only man in Europe who could stand up to the kings repeatedly and win. And
Hmm.
and so the basically that that it was this innovation that protected us from the states, where and gave us kind of again, the Pope was like the international lawyer. He was the judge for all of the states. He was the conscience. The Pope, the Catholic Church became the conscience of the heads of state.
Mm.
And it was that they were the heads of state were getting really sick and tired of this nagging conscience that they really wanted to get separated from. And this is where
Hmm.
we got the first separation of the Catholic Church and state that gave us
Yeah.
the subsequent separation of church and state.
Well, and you might also, and I think it is giving. I think it's also worth pointing out. Be, I just feel I feel like it should be pointed out. It wasn't like bishops
Mhm.
at the time didn't give the kings an excuse as well, right? Just
Yeah.
with, just as just to the idea of the relative corruption that exists, that has always existed within any sufficiently complicated system and organ and hierarchy. Um, so which it's it's
Mhm.
which is to say, like, it's you sow the seeds of your own destruction one way or the other, right? Like it's
Mhm.
when the church would let a bishop be improper in some form, whether he would take a wife, or whether he would
Yeah.
sleep around, or whether he was just living a lavish lifestyle, right? We always
Yeah.
have this image of like the fat bishop who's
Yeah.
not the
Surrounded by
bishop of,
gold.
right, surrounded by gold, not the bishop of Les Mis, right? Not the
Yeah.
bishop who gives Jean Valjean
Yep.
uh, Jean Valjean the silver with which he can start his life over, right? But the bishop who would not have taken in the man
Yep.
in such a way.
Oh
And
yeah.
so it's worth pointing out that, again, just that no, none of us are angels at the end of the day,
Oh yeah.
not even the people of the church. I think
But
we'll kind of
having
get to
a
that as we move through the book.
but having that good corporate institution of the Catholic Church, because we are the first corporation in human
Hmm.
history, and we are by far the most successful. And
Sure.
we managed to reverse engineer all of the essential attributes of a corporation that make it work really, really well as a mass production engine. And we reverse engineered all of that basically by either by chance or by papal infallibility, basically, or
Yeah.
where we could really say, hey, this really is the one true holy church, because God knows we have not been run by brains. We were
Hmm.
not run. This is not an institution run by brainiacs, and
I'll
is
say that's one
often
of my
very
favorite
corrupt.
arguments that you presented to me.
I know. It's like there's no institution on earth that was this corrupt, that had this many problems, and still
Hmm.
managed to grow for 20 straight centuries into the most powerful institution on the planet,
Well,
and
not
with
even
over a
Lutheranism
billion.
could hold on to it, right?
Huh?
Not even
Yeah.
Lutheranism, and not
Mhm.
even Eastern Orthodoxy,
Yep.
because we have the split of the Russian Patriarch from Constantinople in
Oh
recent
yeah.
history.
And from Ukraine, it's like that they'll
It's
shift
very
them with it
topical, yeah.
because it's a super, because again, this is a problem that Orthodoxy has, because it's they have weak bishops, like politically weak bishops, not
Hmm.
like they have bad wills or bad faith or anything like that, but they're
Yeah.
politically weak. This allows them to become prey for the states, and this is why they get to be so a much more political religion than, or version of Christianity, than other versions. And
Hmm.
this is also the same reason why Protestant churches really ended up being like basically the handmaids and bitches of the kings, in a way that even the Orthodox are they're just not. Like
Hmm.
Orthodox will just be like, just kill us, like they told,
Yeah.
like they would straight, like if you were like really, really telling them like, hey, if the state was telling them, hey, you're going to do this sort of apostasy here, or like that, eventually they would be like, just kill us.
Yeah.
If it was a minor political ask or something like that, they would do it. Like, okay, we're going to schism with Constantinople, no problem. And those guys are heretics anyway, whatever. And
Yeah.
but if you were like, hey, we're going to deny God altogether, it's like, just kill me. Nah. It's like, I'm going to die first. Whereas Protestants would be like, gay men in the churches, no problem. And so it's like, this is because they don't even have the bishops. They're basically just individuals at the mercy of the state. And so it was their rejection of authority, their rejection of church hierarchy that made them fracture into 37,000 and counting, bitches for the state that have no ability to stand up to the state. And they're far weaker than the Eastern Orthodox politically weaker for this reason. And when you have a secular state that has no conscience, so naturally you're going to end up with a Protestant religion that bears very, very scarce representation, it does not at all resemble the Christianity of the Bible. It just doesn't. And certainly not of the early church or the early church fathers. It just doesn't look like that because it is too politically weak. And it was this innovation of the Catholic Church, probably by accident, but more likely by necessity, that or really guided by the Holy Spirit, that worked out really, really well. And not only did that as the first corporation in human history that had a head start on all of the other corporations by like a solid 1,000 years. This was the this was our main innovation that gave us that power and ended up inventing all of the other corporations because it was a Catholic king who invented the first publicly traded corporation, which is this is the proper kind of corporation that all governments should be made of. If we had done that at the start, if we had realized that the medieval monarchy was not the way to go, and what we actually needed was a corporate monarchy that was in the likeness of the church, we would not have no Reformation, no schism, no other problems, and we would probably be close to Ancapistan right now. And no Protestant Reformation, no liberalism, no world wars. If we had just had that, if we had had that one change of that separation of ownership and management, none of this would have been a problem. But we're here.
I see that as a function of there needs to be to understand the day. You need to experience night.
Yeah,
like that's where the cycle, or like I like talking about waves on the shore, but that's where the cycle element really comes into play for me. And I think there's, for example, the Romans knew how to make concrete, and that knowledge was lost for, a couple thousand years until basically the modern day. And then we go out and look and we find, oh crap, they knew what they were doing here, right? With something like that. So I think there's something to be said. I think there's something to be said for that in that way too. But let's,
do you want to continue on to chapter 2, or do you want to save that for next time?
I could do both.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think maybe saving it would be good from the standpoint of an hour 22 is good consumption, and we can kind of wrap up some of the themes. But your call, your show.
Let's go ahead and wrap it there, and we'll continue. This will be like basically every Friday for people, is going through chapter by chapter and unwind. And this is such a good book about where did this thing come from, what are the exact problems, how did they come about, and why are what are their logical implications, and what and where does it go from, and what do we do about it? And it's so good.
So here's a funny thing. So let's wrap on this. Let's wrap on this idea for a little bit, because this is kind of like what I was alluding to before we came on. So I'm going to say two things. The first is that I constantly in these conversations, I have an issue putting liberalism per se at the center of the woes, right? Of that thing that actually moves, that thing that actually creates the worst elements of what we see today. But as the practicing skeptic, I maintain the right to be wrong about something, and I'm open to accepting new information. That's kind of where I sit, even reading his applications of liberalism. And again, it could
Mhm.
just it's probably in part a trick my brain is doing, but like I always substitute in progressivism or socialism for it,
Yeah.
because I would say I said this this is
Well, those are
the episode.
apotheoses of liberalism. So it's like these are the
Right.
purified forms of it.
Sure. Well, I was, the funny, I was talking, I just had recorded with Tommy Salmons. We talked about, did I say his last name right? Whatever.
Yes.
Hopefully I did it right, Tommy. But we were talking about left and right, kind of with some of the disagreements that, you and I might have over it, or him and you have had over it
Mhm.
at different times. And I think I did a good job of laying out my schema
Oh,
for
I
it.
have
And
to
it's an
listen to
idea
that.
that I'm developing. But one of the things I said is kind of tying to this is like, okay, so maybe they were like twins, liberalism and socialism, and like socialism like ate liberalism in
Mhm.
the womb, and or like liberalism was stillborn in a
Mhm.
sense. And again, this could
He
be a matter
goes
of
into it in this
sentimentality
chapter.
for me. Go ahead.
He actually goes into it in the second chapter at the end that liberalism, by its natural propensity to totalitarianism and to the communist revolution, it leads by way of its natural propensity to totalitarianism to the communist revolution. It can be said
Yeah.
that that it is the soul of all modern revolutions and of the revolution, capital R revolution itself.
And that's where I wanted to, that was the second, so that'll be the third thing I want to get to. The second point I want to hit
Mhm.
is, I will say that the bishop, and I'm just saying the bishop because I can't remember the last name, I'm sure it'll stick with me by
Lefebvre.
the end of this series. What was it?
His name is Bishop Lefebvre. Archbishop
Lefebvre.
Lefebvre, Marcel Lefebvre.
So with what Lefebvre says, it is very akin to our friend Matthew Erickson,
Yes,
who
he's
simultaneously, like, I'm like, it's one of those things. It's like we're operating on the same frequency, but then there's like, it's just like a little bit here and a little bit there that I'm like, no, that's not the right note, right? Like you're playing the
yeah.
song in a different way than I'm used
Uh-huh.
to. You're improvising on areas that I wouldn't improvise on. So I will say that there's analogies in that, and that's the funny thing about myself, right? Because
Yeah.
I still consider myself of, broadly speaking, the liberal tradition, but the skeptical tradition for me traces much farther back in history. But it's not a skepticism without a purpose, right? As I've kind of delineated before, it's
Well,
more of
yes.
like, go ahead.
Your skepticism is a kind that presupposes a divine order, which is
Yes.
very, very different
Mm-hmm.
than the liberal skepticism, which is why
Yeah.
yours ends up being so much better. Is that
Mm-hmm.
what you're using skepticism as a tool for deriving knowledge in the scientific method, the same way that the Catholic, which again was invented by the Catholic Church,
Sure,
and
for
that
sure.
like that's the actual proper use of skepticism, is for the purpose of verification. And
Yeah.
this is what this is why you call it sense making, because it actually
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
This is the sense making method. And
Mm-hmm.
liberalism has ruined, epistemologically ruined all of our sense making apparati. And
Mm-hmm.
this is where your go ahead and plug your stuff, that this is where all that comes in.
Yeah. So I think so. It's like, so I think that's going to be fun about doing this series, is that
Mhm.
we're kind of in different positions. But as I read it, it's one of those things. It's like, and I think it does have to do with my Catholic upbringing, is obviously
Mhm.
a huge part of that. And I'll credit the Benedictines in particular, as I always will until my dying breath. That's why the Benedictine cross is behind me there.
Yep.
Like
I went to a
but it's
Benedictine university, so I'm right there with
knew
you.
it.
Hmm. Oh yeah.
I knew it. But so like, but so I think I'm looking forward to kind of going through this, if for no other reason than I enjoy walking the tightropes. And I think, again, where I might make some formal critiques of his writing style, um, it's I do see the point he makes of Luther breaking down the order established by the church. I think what I'll be interested to see is how he answers why the church let that happen, in a sense, or whether that, or do we get to the point where maybe that
Yeah.
needs to happen as a part of
I think
as
for
a
a
part of
person I think for a
God's
person
plan.
who doesn't understand economics, doesn't understand politics, he does an excellent job of of answering it. Again, for as someone who is I consider I read to be a political neophyte.
Hmm.
But I mean he does an excellent
I think
job
that's
of
a good
figuring it out.
observation, actually. Yeah,
And
that's a good observation.
I think he actually uh Yeah. Oh, yeah. Here we go. This is he does give it's 3 chapters in. He finally goes into a definition, a really functional definition of liberalism. Basically,
Okay.
like right here, that you know from and we can just this is chapter 3, but we're gonna kind of read it back in for chapters 1 and 2. I probably should have started with this, but because I didn't realize he didn't define it until 3 chapters, and I've read most of the book already. So,
Yeah. Well,
but
and I'll say that was something that was tough for me, but I was like, I'm sure if
yeah.
a sufficiently long enough work is going to have an established definition eventually. So you just kind of got to work your way in. And in fact, I think that's part of what makes a book, is the fact that you kind of like, okay, here's a little bit, here's a little bit, here's the big thing.
Hmm.
Did you go ahead, if you want to read that? I can't read the screen.
Yeah. So he says that, I can affirm that liberalism is identified with the revolution. Liberalism is the revolution in all spheres, the radical revolution. Bishop Guam wrote some lines on the revolution, which seem to me to completely characterize liberalism itself. If tearing away its mask, you ask of the revolution, who are you? It will say to you, I am not what is thought. Many people speak of me, and very few know me. I am not neither carbonarianism, nor rioting, nor the change from monarchy to the republic, nor the substitution of one dynasty for another, nor the temporary disturbance of the public order. I am not the howlings of the Jacobins, nor the furies of the La Montagne, nor the battle of the barricades, nor looting, nor arson, nor the agrarian law, nor the guillotine, nor the drownings. I am not the Maraz, the Robespierre. I am not or Buff, Bafou. I'm see if I can uh,
Here, what's
zoom
the
in on
page?
this and Control Shift. There we go. Much better. Yeah, of the La Montagne, nor the battle of the barricades, nor looting, nor arson, nor agrarian law, nor the guillotine, nor the drownings. I am not the Marat, the Robespierre, the Babot, or the Mazzini, or the Kossuth. These men are my sons; they are not I. These things are my works; they are not I. These men and these things are transitory facts. I am a permanent state. I am the hatred of all order which man has not established and in which he is not king and God altogether. I am the proclamation of the rights of man without care for the rights of God. I am the foundation of the religious and social state upon the will of man instead of the will of God. I am God dethroned and man in his place. This is why I am called revolution. That is to
Hmm.
say, overthrow.
Oh, damn. That is exactly where he was going, wasn't it? Because that was the
Yep.
point. It's like, it seems to be his critique is more with the revolution. Of course, he's making a very clear allegory there to Satan,
Yep.
as well.
Yeah,
Um, and
this is why he starts off by saying that that liberty, that an absurd definition of liberty is what liberalism tries to tempt the masses with. It's a reference to Satan, and
hmm,
that he's trying to set up a kind of a Satanism sort of parallel to liberalism. Basically, his idea of liberalism is an absurd definition of liberty. He says that the liberal is a fanatic for independence. He extols it to the point of absurdity in every domain. And that's and you could say that liberalism for him is liberty taken to the absurd. And
yeah,
that might be a functional definition for him. That
yeah,
and that's why I really like this definition right here, because this
hmm,
basically encapsulates what I mean by liberalism. That particularly that last bit, that I am the hatred of all order which man has not established and in which he is not king and God altogether. Like that once, like the proclamation of the rights of man without care for the rights of God. And again, for me as a Catholic, and I say, hey, God is love. as central to the definition of Catholic of how Catholics define God. And that this idea that, hey, you're not born by yourself, you don't create yourself, that you are actually born from other people in the image of God, in this image of love, in this image of family. The image of family is the image of love that we are supposed to be inhabiting. We don't always do that. In fact, a lot of the time we don't do that, but that's very different from what we're supposed to be doing, quite obviously. So this idea that you have self-ownership apart from your family is the essence of liberalism. I think that is completely wrong, completely against natural law, completely against the natural order, particularly as Aquinas defined it. So so like this right here is the functional definition of liberalism that we probably should have started this with, but I'm glad we got it in a chapter early.
Well, and it kind of can. And this is the difference between doing a lecture series and a read along, which is what we're kind of doing. We're doing the read along. We're not doing a lecture series. It's I think it's all. Let's before we completely end, it's also worth again kind of pointing out that the Catholic Church we see today is not the Catholic Church that the bishop is speaking on. And in particular,
this is pre-Vatican II.
Very much so. Yes. But in particular, I wanted to point out something that we just read over. Hang on. I just had it pulled up, but then I was looking for the part you were at because I just got my little iPad here since I had no. Here.
This is page 35 that I'm on right now.
Yeah, it's something that we read today. I'm trying to find it. I just had it. It was basically something. Maybe it was in the. Here we go. It's actually in the preface, in the author's introduction. So it is there. A little bit of reflection can help common sense. If the post-conciliar age is dominated, this is page. What page is this? This is page 13. 13. Is it there that a little bit of reflection could help common sense? If the post-conciliar age is dominated by the revolution in the church, is this not very simply because the council itself introduced it? The council, this is 1789 in the church, declared Cardinal Suenens. The problem, quote, the problem of the council was to assimilate the values of 2 centuries of liberal culture, says Cardinal Ratzinger. You might have noticed, and I certainly picked up on it, this is for the non-Catholics in the audience, that there was Benedict the 15th and Benedict the 14th were featured prominently in the in the words that in this book. And of course, Cardinal Ratzinger became Benedict the 16th, who was the first pope, only the second pope in history to not serve out his term. To serve out his rule, right? And so he's basically become this. He's had to. I mean, like, dude, what I mean? When I like that was one of those moments where I'm like, oh crap, because you see the corollaries of the Vatican II, criticisms, and then I'm reading the words of like old popes, which it's not my. I do more of the philosophy thing. I don't read the popes maybe as much as I should. But to the point of I saw that, and just the literal physical history that we've lived through, where you see this very atypical usurpation of the papacy to install somebody who, at the beginning of this week, was offering a mass for the consecration to the Divine Mother for ostensibly peace in Russia and Ukraine, and then today comes out and condemns, and today it comes out in the chorus of everything else with the rest of the USG, the U.S. Government or U.S. globalists, depending on which one you want to put.
The global American empire.
Yeah.
Gay.
It works on many levels. That's why I'm using USG going forward. But this is also the Pope who's partnered up with MasterCard and other people to create inclusive capitalism.
I know.
So there's the rot. So for whatever it is we are speaking of, the rot is very much a part of everything.
And he goes into what happened at Vatican II, because he was one of the cardinals at Vatican II who saw what the Masons were trying to do, and because it was Vatican II was a Masonic infiltration by Masonic bishops and a Masonic pope, who were known and some of which were excommunicated later after it became like public knowledge, because Freemasons they're a very anti-Catholic sect. And like some of the key bishops at Vatican II who wrote the thing, were Masonic infiltrators who were like, explicitly heretics and who should have been excommunicated. And, and they were later on when it was found out. And so this is where the chaos of Vatican II comes from. And he's going to take us through that later later in the book, probably like 10 chapters in or something like that. And so you see exactly why your Vatican II and post-Vatican II popes have just been woo-woo. It's because of this. It's because of this Masonic infiltration that has occurred and has been very, very difficult to beat back because we don't have any state support. And that's why instead of focusing on fixing the rot in the Catholic at the head of the papacy, I'm focusing on getting the state back in line, and focusing on getting a corporate state going, because that's the sort of reinforcement that we would need to stop liberalism in its tracks and reverse it. And from there you can reverse the rot in the Catholic Church. Because I see again, it was never that the church itself was the problem, or its teachings or its institutions or whatever. It was that we lost our state support, and that ended up causing the problems of liberalism. And really, it's because we had badly malformed states to begin with. Medieval monarchy is a malformation of what monarchy is supposed to be as a corporation, a corpus.
Sure.
And it ends up with, because there's no separation of ownership and management, you basically end up with a headless institution that has to, get its head from somewhere else. And where it's like basically the church had to transplant her head onto the monarchy, and that works for a while, and then it has a greatly diminishing return. Whereas if you separate that and now the church is that the state is now running it around with its head cut off. Basically, it has no brain, has no conscience, and because it's now has that the separation of church and state means the state is going to be basically a headless institution with no conscience, or like reptile. Basically, this is why they're reptiles. And and so what you need is to put the head back on back on the state. That you do that by separating the ownership and management. And because now you will have a state that reflects the corporate body of the church. Now you can have a real union of church and state, because before you could not have a real union of church and state, because these are two functionally distinct institutions that are not just formally distinct but functionally distinct. And now with this with a corporate monarchy, you can have a real a real union of church and state, where prior one was not really possible. You could kind of make it work for a little while, but it was not going to last, which is what happened. So, and if you want to help support that, again, misisgop.org/donate. Signing up for even small donations monthly, it helps, because that's the beauty, is that our strategy is cheap. If nothing else, it will be cheap. So
yeah, let me do that thing you asked me to do before. So if you guys, if you liked anything that I had to say today, and you want to know more about my method and the kinds of things that I investigate, do me a favor and visit beenawake.com. Become a subscriber with your email address. If you would feel so generous, become a patron. You get your first year 50% off right now if you go and sign up there. Substack is going to be my home. That's where I'm going to be. That's my primary monetization. So I'm an original writer, and I host a podcast where I break down the news. I talk about philosophy, and I also talk about mindset. Oh, all social media at the LB Muniz. And you Twitter people, go follow me on Instagram, because I'm doing more with videos and graphics and stuff.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And this has been Popular Liberty, signing off.